Welcome to SAM Conversation, a program of South Asia Monitor. Today our topic is US initiating peace talks with Russia. It is our pleasure to welcome Major General Jagatbir Singh, retired, distinguished fellow, United Service Institution of India, and editor, The Salute magazine. Yesterday, 24th February 2025, marked 3 years of the Russo-Ukraine war, which began exactly on 24th February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine as part of an escalation of its earlier war, which began in 2014. Considered as the largest and deadliest of conflicts in Europe since World War II, it has caused hundreds of thousands of military casualties, tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilian casualties, and over the 3 years of this conflict, Ukraine has lost about 20% of its territory to the Russians. From a population of about 41 million, about 8 million are reported to be displaced, and more than 8.2 million of Ukrainians have fled, resulting in the largest of refugee crises since World War II. India always avoided any public condemnation of Russia for this conflict. At a time when no nation helped India with urgently required weaponry, it was the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as Soviet Union, which supplied up to 80% of our requirements for the Army, Navy, and Air Force at political prices. Under the Treaty of Peace and Friendship and Cooperation, framed in 1971. And just as the Russo-Ukraine war was about to complete 3 years, the second time US President Donald Trump literally played his trump card by splitting with his European allies and not just refusing to blame Russia for its invasion, but also shaking hands with Vladimir Putin with a view to stopping this war. As a part of his attempt to get this war to stop, and there seems to be some light at the end of the tunnel. Gen Jagatbir, you are someone who's been following this for the last 3 years. From some brief comments about how and why it began, and thereafter, whatever we can have from you, please.
Good evening, sir. And firstly, I thank you very much for calling me to be part of this podcast by Sam. And it's indeed wonderful for me to be here present with you all and all your viewers. And I consider it a rare honor and privilege to be called to this platform to give my views on the Russia-Ukraine war. I say today that a turning point is visible. Now, as you rightly said, as we're approaching the third anniversary, the conflict today is at a turning point. And a sign of that was the latest issue of The Economist magazine that shows a picture representative of the president of the US, Trump, with his back turned. So, literally, as you said, He's turned his back on his European allies. Everyone thought at the beginning of the war that, the problem was NATO expanding towards Russia. And then people said in between that NATO's expanded by taking Norway and Sweden and other countries into their fold. And today, what you've seen is a complete reversal of US policy. That the first signs
Absolutely.
were visible on 12th February. And those signs were visible earlier when the uh, election campaign was going on. That time, that time he was not president, he was candidate of the Republican Party, former President Trump. Termed it as a ridiculous war. So no one could have imagined this sudden reversal, sudden turnabout. And today, literally, I say the NATO is facing its biggest existential crisis that it's faced because bulk of the funding for NATO was done by the United States. And constant refrain was that the European powers need to, step up on their defense spending. Bulk of the things, people, and resources were given by the United States throughout when they were confronting Soviet Union. But after the Cold War collapsed in 1991, and that's when the seeds of this whole thing started. You see, there are three ways of looking at it. So everybody the world over says this war started in 2024, Feb 2024. A Ukrainian will say it started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. But if
Yes.
you look back, as far as Russian imperialist designs, I won't even say Soviet Union, get back to the Soviet Empire. I'll say Russian imperialist designs were that after 1991, they felt weakened because at that time, President uh, Reagan, at that time, and his security advisor, very famously made a statement that NATO will not expand an inch eastward. And then you've seen the steady expansion of NATO, and you've seen these agreements which were all thrown to the winds, literally the Minsk agreement and all, where the nuclear weapons, which were Russian nuclear weapons stationed in Ukraine, they were removed. So, I mean, Russia was looking at this. They've considered the Ukrainians as a Slavic people, more aligned to them than to Western Europe. And they felt that the minute it was a red line for them, NATO getting into Ukraine. And they had one set of rules for Belarusia, and they wanted to apply the same set of rules as far as Ukraine goes. Initially, the war, since you asked me to talk a bit on this, initially everyone thought when the war took place that, it was perceived that it will be an overwhelming result in in Russian favor. They'll just go over, but go through, Ukraine like a knife, hot knife through butter. That never happened. Thereafter, analysts felt that Russia would collapse because the sanctions imposed, the combined West, arming of Ukraine, and the support of the population, the losses you've talked about. Russia apparently has lost 175,000 combatants. Now, that's a lot. That's about, uh, you can imagine over 3 years, every month, how many it adds up to. So that's a lot which losses which have taken place, but no one is sure of the exact figures. But there are large amounts of people who've been displaced, like you said, and apart from this, there are large amount of fatalities. To the extent that Russia even had to get in when the inclusion into Kursk took place, they had to get in troops from North Korea. And I'm told that there are large amount of troops who have been suffered casualties there also. About one third of the North Koreans have suffered casualties. So that is there. Today, the West is divided. The first sign of that was, as I said, during the election campaign. And after that, you had the comments of the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on the 12th of February when he spoke at a conference or a NATO conference. Thereafter, you had the Vice President France literally showing a mirror to Europeans at the Munich Security Conference. And the latest thing is, I mean, that West was even divided on the language of the statement to be brought out on to mark the third year, which was yesterday by the G7, and the resolution which was to be passed in the UN General Assembly, and I'm not talking of Security Council, in the General Assembly against condemning this invasion of the Ukraine, uh, Russia, US, North Korea, and Iran were the I mean, were amongst the 18 countries, four of them, which voted against it. Now, just see which are the countries, how things have changed so fast. India, of course, has been consistent in its stance and it abstained. So you had countries like France and UK and all, Germany, they voted for it. 93 voted for it, 18 against, and 65 abstained, including India, China, and Brazil. So all the BRIC countries,
Your Honor.
except for Russia, abstain. So look at the changes that have taken place in world geopolitics. It's something that nobody could have imagined. No analyst
Yes.
imagined it. None of the analysts imagined it. I've listened to numerous analysts from various think tanks of the US. Nobody even, in fact, even today the language is that the opposite. That it's basically pro-Ukrainian thing, the narrative which is coming out. So, I mean, this nobody could imagine. So, as I said,
Yep.
and there have been attritional conflicts, marginal gains have taken place. And as you rightly brought out, sir, economies of both countries are suffering. Ukraine has been damaged to a large degree. There are immense amount of casualties. And President
And
Trump promised to end the war. And he's,
wo-
after being sidelined throughout by President Joe Biden, I mean, nobody will talk to Putin and all that. Today, what happened? Zelensky has been called a dictator. And President Trump has spoken on a 90-minute conference call with President Putin to try to resolve the thing. And following that conversation, see how fast things move. Within 3 to 4 days, there have been negotiations which took place, not in a European country, because there's no European country which is neutral, except for Switzerland. So where did the negotiations take place? In Riyadh. And who was there at the negotiations? The people present at the negotiations were the Americans, represented by the Secretary of State, by the NSA, by Stephen Witkoff, who's the person in charge of Middle East, his envoy, and Lavrov was there. So that's the level. So the talks are. Look at the number of different talks taking place. There are talks in Riyadh to end the war. European leaders have met separately, and at the General Assembly, you have a vote talking to condemn the war. So there are three
it-
parallel things carrying on.
it's it's really a bunch of surprises, you know. But when going back 3 years ago, it was one clearly remembers that there were enough of warnings that were issued by Vladimir Putin that look, don't get into this NATO, don't get into them. But Volodymyr Zelensky was bent, was evil. He was seeing his own, what he thought was a very bright side, and
Absolutely, sir.
this carried on the way this man has, allowed his country to get, so badly bashed up just because there's a host of NATO countries which are supplying him with weaponry.
Entire
And
NATO was
this,
supplying him with weaponry.
when you look back at, one is not one is not trying to. I don't want to sound like a moralist, but now when you look back at Biden's tenure, look at what he's achieved, what he's done for the Americans.
Yes, you're absolutely right as far as your comments are concerned. So there's no doubt of what has happened. The red lines were visible, and but no one thought that Russia would, cross, because slowly the West has been crossing multiple red lines and taking many other countries under the umbrella of NATO. And today, I'll say there's even a divide between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, because Western Europe has the money. They have the resources, but they're spending less on defense because they feel less threatened. Whereas Eastern Europe, it is totally the opposite. As far as Eastern Europe is concerned, they're spending more on defense and they are worried about their borders with Russia. You know, Poland is one country, but at the contrary, when you look at it, how many of them are actually willing to put boots on the ground? That was something that was missing. So, I, rightly saying, and if we go back into history, we're all aware of all the revolutions that took place there, the removal of presidents, and how Zelensky came into power and what happened. I think let's not go there. So let's talk about the future. What about the negotiations? What's going to happen? How's that going to take place? How can you resolve issues which are incompatible collisions of reality? Everybody has their own take on this. So where will you come to a common meeting ground, sir?
But
So I always say,
according to some reports, there seems to be is Zelensky is sort of actually feeling the pinch now, because
uh,
there are
yeah,
statements being attributed to him to, should I step down, or may even accept a part of his country being you never know what comes out in the next few days, literally. But all we can be very thankful about is that I think there is I think we can say it's the beginning of the end uh, is approaching, and as far as India is concerned, it's a kind of a vindication that we remained neutral. And as a military man, and we are both from the armored corps. We both used T, the T series of T series of Russian tanks, T-54s, T-55s, which we needed very badly in 1971. And then the later, um, those of us who used their equipment, which we got very timely, there, there's no denying a, a soft corner. Well, that's I won't go to more than that, into personal opinions. But the fact remains that as a country, we remained, quite consistently neutral, and I think it was very significant when Mr. Narendra Modi said, "I'm for on the side of peace." He put that one statement of his stands out. Jagatbir.
you cover a lot of ground, sir. So I'll go over each issue separately and little slowly, sir. The first issue is the ceasefire talks which have started. And preceding this talks, very important statement was given out by the Secretary of Defense for the US when he categorically said that it is very difficult, and he said it's unrealistic for Ukraine to get back the territory that has been captured or lost. The second issue, which he said, which I feel was more important than the first issue, because the first issue, everybody in their minds had felt that yes, that is there. Second issue when he said that there's no question of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Now that's a huge, huge step. And the
Yes,
third issue, he said that even if anybody positions their troops in NATO for anything, Article 5 will not apply. So you've seen in one stroke, in one day, on 12th of February, how the matrix changed completely. So that's one
yes,
thing. And now, when the talks took place, I've been reading about that. Three other things have been said. I mean, everybody is going to focus on, rebuilding, how this ceasefire will take place, what are the security guarantees. And I think when President Putin says that, he's a dictator, he never won election, President Zelensky, in true style, threw the last card he had. He said, in that case, I'm willing to resign, but give me NATO membership. Now, surely NATO membership doesn't hinge on his being president or not being president, irrespective of who is president of Ukraine. President Putin will, I mean, Russia will not see X or Y or Z as a president of Ukraine and membership for NATO. I mean, so I mean, I'll call it like almost like a red herring being thrown there. So that's one thing. So this alternatives of NATO membership were discussed earlier, but with the American statement brought out and the way they talked in the summit in Munich, and Munich, of course, they never touched it, but the earlier summit, and after that, I think this totally ruled out. And in fact, now what I've been given to understand is that the focus, one of the issues discussed in the talks was, restoring the embassy staff between US and Russia back to the earlier levels, creating a high level team for negotiation, and exploring ways to, strengthen economic cooperation. So what they're hinting at is Russia wants, naturally, they want the sanctions lifted. So if the sanctions are lifted, that SWIFT, which was that, financial currency, stopping the financial currencies from being transferred to each other, that will go. They'll be part and parcel of the, globalized world order again, as far as trade goes. So, I mean, these are huge things. And President Putin is going to get demand his uh, pound of flesh. Now, a lot of people have talked of how do you ensure security guarantees. One of the things people said is the best security guarantee, apart from peacekeeping troops, is to say that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And if they violate it, then Ukraine can be taken as a member of NATO. Now, US has negated that. Next, without US support, how long can Ukraine last? What is the percentage of weapons? What is the percentage of money being pumped in by NATO, by US? All these long-range missiles, the air defense systems, bulk of them were from US. Today, earlier President Biden had denied certain targets by HIMARS and all to be used. Today, they'll stop supplying those systems. Then what happens? How much ammunition do they have? We all know, sir, how ammunition is calculated, how they come in. Say if your chain goes for that, I think maximum couple of 3 to 6 months is what the reserves they'll have. And how do you encounter that? How do you overcome that? So this is something which I've talked about. The next thing is, how do you enforce the peace? Who will do that? Who's going to ensure? The biggest problem for Ukraine is security guarantees. So, what is sort of security guarantees can be done? Now, Prime Minister of Britain, the UK Prime Minister, he said we'll be willing to provide peacekeepers. We'll be willing to do this. Earlier, France had offered. Now, France is not that keen. And Poland has ruled it out. So, I mean, somebody has to come in. And today, President Putin has categorically said, or the Russians have categorically said, that any peace, any forces from a NATO country will be seen as an infringement of the NATO, on our soil. So, I mean, on Ukraine soil. So, I mean, that's issue that people have to think of. So these are things. And the next issue you raise, sir, is the most important one, and that is India's stance during the war and how the implications of this will affect India. So you very correctly said that India, our Prime Minister said this is not a era for war. So I've said that India has been consistent in its stand throughout. And we've always focused on dialogue and diplomacy. We've held a balanced position, and our Prime Minister has visited both Kiev and Moscow. He's engaged with both the leaders. We also, like you talked of, tanks coming from Russia. Yes, but bulk of our equipment came from Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union defense industrial complex is scattered, and a large part of that was in Ukraine. Some
Ukraine,
portion of that, yeah.
yes.
So we've got our aircraft from there. Our AN series of aircraft came from there, the AN-32. But That's one thing. The overall of the AN-32 is also been delayed because of this. But apart from that, we also get all the gas turbine engines for our ships from there. So we get a lot of engines from there. And that two of those facilities were hit by Russian missiles. So we've had disruptions in our supply chain. So then you have disruptions as far as your
For
spares
almost
go.
10 years, for almost 10 years after the breakup of USSR, we had, this thing, crisis of spares.
Absolutely, which has again taken place now, but so that was something that is known. Everybody knows because will they give other countries spares or will they focus on their own thing? So, and when a facility gets damaged, that chain, it takes time to rebuild it. So that's one thing. Other thing is that look at the economic downside of the whole thing. We've been accused by the West of getting oil from Russia at cheaper prices. That's there. But the cost of fuel, because of the tensions, the cost of fuel has gone up, fertilizer has gone up, food has gone up. So as a result, inflation has gone up. As a result, currencies have fallen. And you've seen the result of the Indian currency weakening on the, stock market. So I mean, it's all a cascading effect. So as far as I am concerned, so I feel the best news is to stop this war. No military person wants war. But the problem is how you can resolve the differences which are so deep rooted. And I personally feel that, though I've always maintained that the two countries who can stop this war are US and Russia. There's no third country. But for
Yes.
them, but for this, I always maintain that Ukraine should be part of that negotiation. So you may like to sideline European powers, but you cannot afford to not have Ukraine as part of the negotiation. So that's my thing. But what stands out, sir, because of all this is the way today US has changed track from one side to the other or reversed its position. And suddenly you said surprised. I'll term it that the Europeans were shocked. They were shocked. It was almost a sense of disbelief in most European capitals, and that disbelief is carrying on in the analysts, you see. So, what does it show you? That today you have to have your own capability to stand on your own feet. You must have developed your own hard power because anybody can, if you're too dependent on somebody, they can, what if they choose a point and a time to discard you when you're most vulnerable. So, I mean, that's something that needs to be seen and something that we must look at, sir. So, for India, as I said, our multi alignment policy, I must say, sir, that this is something that has been extremely successful. And we must, complement the way we have carried out, walked the tightrope, as somebody said. We again abstained from the vote today. So we never took any side again. And dialogue, I've said, and also another issue that nobody talks of much is that, we couldn't afford to take any other stance because if we had taken a very pro-Western and US stance, Russia would have gone closer to China. And for us, a close alliance between China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, that has got far more damaging consequences for India. We have to have Russia on our side. As you said, we got old friendship, deep friendship. They've supported us in 1971 war, and they've been constantly by our side. We also had a problem back to this defense exports. You know the problem with the S-400. So the Americans were going to put Katsa against us. We got out of that. But now that fear is not there, sir. So, I think we need to end this Russian alienation, sir, and that removal of the sanctions, and that's extremely important. So, I mean, this is it's a very tricky time the world is in, but as you said, there's some ray of hope that is there, sir. So I hope things work out, and I hope things work out well as far as the conflict is concerned, sir.
You put it across very relevantly and very clearly. Uh, Whatever it is, I think there is no denying that Donald Trump needs to be thanked for, call it whatever, is literally his trump card, but something which he showed that he had the guts to do. There's so much this man was, that facing. He's headstrong, and he's, but whatever it is, all we can do is hope and pray that this war is, effectively ended. Period.
Absolutely right, sir. You know, all wars end sometimes, sir. All wars end sometimes, but the manner in which they end is important because the ending determines the peace that is to follow. Both World War II and Cold War charted a new course as far as the security architecture of Europe and the world is concerned. So let's see. I think there's a new security architecture being unveiled now, and we'll see it as it comes at this at the end of these talks. And hopefully, the complexities of this conflict preclude a very quick solution. But regardless of the outcome of the negotiation, the war in Ukraine has already changed the character of conflicts to a great degree. So, but that's entirely a different issue. So we won't get into that part. But countries have to adapt to the new realities. And the main credibility of the global leaders and the policymakers today will be on how soon this conflict ends. And unfortunately, no conflict has a fit-all settlement. That means everybody's there. But the lessons of a fruitless war, and like you brought out this damage and all, can ensure that, we have more of a lasting peace. But what is the acceptable end is, leaves a lot of scope for the correct definitions as far as, acceptable end for one may be something, acceptable end for Europe may be something, for Russia may be something, for US may be something, but for bulk of the countries around the world, the acceptable ends, the start point is the war must end, so this conflict must end and peace must come back. So that's what I have to say, sir. And once again, I thank you very much for calling me here, sir, to present my views.
No, it was very, very nice for hearing all that you put across. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, sir, and Jai Hind.